This seminar is a part of our ASEN seminar series, which is called Ethnicity, Nationalism and the Self. So today, Professor Hylland Eriksen from the University of Oslo, a professor of social anthropology, will talk about the personhood, nationhood, and the other ways of belonging or not. So let me introduce you to. Let me introduce him to you. Hylland Eriksen is a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo, as I said. His fields of research include identity, nationalism, globalization, and identity politics. A considerable portion of Eriksen's work has focused on popularizing social anthropology and conveying basic cultural relativism as well as criticism of Norwegian nationalism and Norwegian public debate. So he has written the basic textbook using introductory courses in social anthropology at most Scandinavian universities. So the book Small Places, Large Issues in English is also used in introductory courses in many other countries and has been widely translated, so as has his other major textbook, Ethnicity and Nationalism, Anthropological Perspectives. Between 2004 and 2010, Thomas directed an interdisciplinary research program, Cultural Complexity in Norway, so at the University of Oslo. And in 2011, Professor Eriksen was awarded an advanced grant from the European Research Council, and he now directs research on three major crises of globalization: economy, finance, environment, climate, and identity culture. So his selected works in English include the Ethnicity and Nationalism, Small Places, Large Issues, Common Denominators, Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Politics of Compromise in Marriages. So a History of Anthropology, Tyranny of the Moment, Past and Slow Time in the Information Age, Globalization Studies in Anthropology, and What is Anthropology, and Engaging Anthropology. So our seminar is going to last about 1.5 hours. So for the first 45 minutes, Professor Eriksen will talk, and for the last 45 minutes, you will have a chance to ask your questions and you will answer. So please welcome and join.
Well, thanks very much to Clement. Thanks very much for inviting me to come here and talk a little bit about some of the, I think, most complicated questions to do with nationalism studies. Namely, I'm going to focus on the relationship between the person, the community, okay, and the nation. And in doing so, I'm going to draw on, you might say, two bodies, okay, of empirical, I should say empirical experience. One is a research project that I've been directing in the suburb of Oslo, which is probably the most super diverse place we've got, okay, in the country. I mean, some years ago, the concept of super diversity came up, and I see that it's now being fairly widely used by social scientists in talking about a new kind of diversity, a sort of accelerated form of diversity characterizing a number of cities. And it was said that, well, you know, in London now, more than 300 languages are customarily spoken. Many of the new minorities do not have a background from the empire. They come from all over the place. They're dispersed. It's very hard for statisticians to work out, you know, where they live and who they are and how long they're going to stay. And reflecting on this, I just glanced at the population statistics for Oslo, which is a fairly peripheral, fairly small European city. And it turned out that, well, in just one of the 16 boroughs of Oslo, 163 languages were spoken, which is also, I mean, not bad, you know, for a peripheral city. So we also have diversity, although that is not the kind of image which is usually projected from Norway. So I'm going to talk a bit from that particular place, which is crucial in many cases, in many respects, when it comes to ideas about national identity, national integration, and so on, multiculturalism, all these tricky questions that we're dealing with all over the place nowadays. And the other piece of empirical material, and that is more, you might say, empirical experience rather than research, derives from a small town on the South Norwegian coast where I have spent the summer holidays in the last 18 years or so. A very different kind of community. And I'm going to make some comparisons between these with a view to trying to elucidate and trying to inspire some reflections on this relationship between person, community, and nation. It's quite clear that there is a way of imagining the nation as a metaphorical kin group or as a metaphorical place. In political anthropology, we generally, at least that's when we start in political anthropology, we generally think of political communities as being based on place. We're now talking about traditional societies, place or kinship. Okay, it's place or kinship, and in many communities there may be tensions between place and kinship because the people who live in the same place do not necessarily belong to the same kin groups. So, for example, in Evans Pritchard's classic work on manure of Sudan, that is a key topic: the tension between place and kinship. The fact that you may end up in a protracted conflict with a different clan or a different lineage. The only problem is that some of the members of that clan or lineage are your neighbours. So there has to be ways of negotiating this relationship between place and kinship. I find that this simple distinction also sheds light on some of the difficulties we have in talking about national identities nowadays. The tension, the problematic tension between place and kinship. So, in other words, the nation is imagined, I'm just positing this now. You may feel free to disagree afterwards. It's frequently imagined as an imaginary place or an imaginary kin group. Okay. As a place. And that kind of place very often is conceptualized as a community. Okay? Community. People who have multiplex relationships, who have a sense of deep shared identity, and frequently, if possible, a shared history. And as Ernest Gellner said, in many ways, if they don't have a shared history, they have to invent it. And they'll, do their best, to create that shared history and make it as deep and profound as possible. Some places have that shared identity, and some has it thrust upon them, some have to invent it. The first place that I'm going to present to you does not have that kind of shared identity. Creating a sense of community there is hard work. It doesn't come by itself. Okay? Oslo is a city which looks roughly like this. Okay, you have a fjord here, and you have some forest around it, and it's been growing in a northeasterly and southeasterly direction along the metro lines for a number of years, with satellite towns sort of growing into the what used to be farmland and have been developed into urban areas. It's divided. There's a river that runs through Oslo. Okay, on the east side of the river, I grew up knowing people who had never been to the east side. They'd been to Bali and to London and to Berlin, but they'd never crossed the river. Because that was, it's just like a London East End. And there's a theory about why, I'm not going into that now, there's a theory about why in some of these West Atlantic, West European cities, the East End became the East End. Because the prevailing winds came from the west. So they got the sting from the bourgeoisie, you see, whereas the bourgeoisie didn't get the sting from the working class. Because in Oslo, it doesn't really make sense because you have afternoon sun on the east side. So it should have been a more attractive side, but it isn't. So you have that very strict, and many people are shocked by learning this because they hear about Scandinavia as being this very egalitarian, social democratic welfare kind of society, and then they come to Oslo and they discover that there's a very, very strict division. In fact, where I live here, okay, very near the university. Had I moved 1 kilometer east, my life expectancy would have gone down by 14 years. It's the difference between Sweden and Morocco. So it can be fairly stark. And on the east side, we have now these satellite towns. We zoomed in on one of them here, where a group of us did field work, on and off for a couple of years. Tried to not find out about ethnic relations primarily, because lots of other people do that. I mean, it's a big industry, ethnic relations, in these complex areas. But looking at conditions for belonging to place. Okay? We were focusing not on kinship, or metaphorical kinship in that ethnic sense, but on place. What are the conditions for belonging to this place? And as I said, creating a sense of place in a new suburb with a lot of flux, with a lot of mobility, with all forms of complexity that you can imagine, both in terms of class and in terms of ethnicity. Creating a sense of place there is hard work. Talking here about a suburb of about 10,000 people, until the 1980s, mostly ethnic Norwegians, now increasingly dominated by minorities. And at the primary school, I mean, there are 2 primary schools, okay? At all of the primary schools in this particular place, 98% of the children have a non-Norwegian origin. I mean, many of them are born in the country, okay? But their parents were not. So they're classified as second-generation immigrants. The largest group being, as the largest non-European minority group in Norway as such, of Pakistani origin. Other large groups are of Somali origin. There are quite a few Poles nowadays. Poles are emerging as the largest, in fact, overall largest immigrant group in the country. And there are Tamils from Sri Lanka, and Vietnamese, and, you know, a smattering of other nationalities. So you have that kind of complexity. And they are ranging from people who have lived there all their lives, and who have lived in Norway virtually all their lives, to people who arrived last week. So you have this, you know, this kind of complexity. When we go into a typical low-rise block of flats, because they don't have high-rise block of flats, you go into typical low-rise block of flats, looks like this, okay? And you have sort of one flat, one apartment on each side. And you go in there and you knock on the doors. In this flat, you'll find that the inhabitants are a Somali single mother and her 5 children. She speaks very little Norwegian. She covers herself up. So she is considered a very weakly integrated person in Norwegian society. I mean, doesn't speak the language well, covers herself up, doesn't really know how to deal with the welfare system. When the tax return form arrives once a year, she throws it in the rubbish because she thinks it's some kind of advertisement. And as every Scandinavian knows, the tax return form is the single most important document, okay, in your life. It's where you show that you're a good citizen and that you're a good member of the imagined community. And she even has to use her children as interpreters when the social workers come. It's not allowed, it's not legal to use children as interpreters, but they do in practice. So she lives there again with the 5 children. On the other side, there's a single ethnic Norwegian man in his late 30s. He's unemployed, so he's on welfare. But he gets enough money to get his sort of twice-a-year trips to Spain, you know, to Southern Europe, okay, to get with the sun, to get drunk, you know, that sort of thing. He plays a lot of computer games, World of Warcraft, that kind of thing, watches TV, and he has no difficulties knowing just, I mean, which buttons to push when he goes into the welfare office to get a little bit extra, okay? A little bit more than he's entitled to. He's sort of fully integrated in that way. And he's in full command of the remote control. And he knows exactly, you know, when to laugh when there's a comedy show. So he's fully sort of culturally integrated. His only problem is that he doesn't know anything. You know? I mean, that's one of the first things that struck me when I started to feel in this area. It was not so much cultural conflicts. Yeah, I mean, there was some talk about the new mosque that they were building. But it was not so much because it was a mosque, it was because it was an Ahmadi mosque, okay? Muslim minority. But that was not really a big issue. But one thing that struck me was loneliness. I mean, that there are so many, mostly single men, who don't know what But he's perfectly sort of, I mean, he can walk out on the street and nobody would give him sort of a nasty look, unlike the Somali woman. That's another sort of destiny. And they don't know each other, only by appearance. Never say hello. In the third flat, just to give you an illustration of the kind of complexity we're talking about here. In the third flat, you have an Iranian couple in the 50s. The children have moved out. And the children, and one of them is studying engineering and the other is training to be a doctor. Okay? 2 children, just like Norwegians. Okay? And they both have jobs in the civil service. And when you walk in, I mean, one of the things that you notice is that they have a big bookshelf. In the living room, they have a big bookshelf. On the left side of the bookshelf, all the books are in Arabic script. The books in Farsi, okay? Iranian books about politics, collections of poetry, history, books from Iran that relatives have sent them, and so on. The other half are Norwegian books, mostly novels. Okay? And when you ask them, I mean, you know, who are you? What's your identity? If you were stupid enough to ask that question, they would shrug and say that, you know, yeah, I mean, we're a bit of this and a bit of that. Okay, so that's just an illustration of the kind of complexity. I'm not going to talk about the fourth family, because there isn't time. I just wanted to illustrate what kind of complexity we get in this sort of community. The children, the 98% of non-Norwegian origin, we tend to identify themselves as foreigners. And they ask, you know, we foreigners. I mean, we Albanians are the best of the foreigners, you know, because we look like Norwegians. We don't look different, like you Pakistanis and Somalis and so on. Whereas the Pakistanis will say, no, we are the best foreigners because we're the most numerous. So we have all this sort of informal power. In other words, they don't identify when you ask them as primarily Norwegian, but they say, you know, we're foreign. Although they may have lived in the country all their lives. As I said, hard work to create a sense of community. And there's flux. There are transnational connections. There are people who cannot afford to buy a PlayStation for the children because they have to send remittances to family, or because they invest in a house that they're going to build in the Punjab, in Pakistan, when they retire. In the school, the teachers are complaining that there are children that turn up at the age of 6 who don't speak a word of Norwegian. How can we teach them? Because they haven't gone to kindergarten. They've stayed at home. So you have that kind of, this is that kind of community, okay? It's a heterogeneous, sprawling kind of community with overlapping networks and with a very weak sort of sense of place. The other place is down on the coast. I'll just show you on the map here where it is. This is what the Scandinavian peninsula looks like. I mean, after Denmark became right-wing, we no longer include them, okay? But now they have a change of government, so maybe after all. Anyway, this is what it looks like. This is where Oslo is, okay? And along the coast, there are a number of small towns with a long history associated with shipbuilding, whaling, until some decades ago. Okay? Some of these towns built their wealth on whaling and on the merchant fleet. And around here, about 3 hours drive from the capital, is the idyllic town of Kragerø, which in the Norwegian imagination is associated with a good life. It's associated with summer, you know, with seagulls and swimming and sailing and white wine, you know, and that sort of thing. And many middle-class people from the Oslo region would have a second home in that area, a summer house, where they spend July and weekends. And it is also a town of about 10,000. But it's integrated in a very different way to food set, as this other place is called. I'll reveal the name now, because everybody knows. I mean, we use the pseudonym when we publish on it, okay, but everybody knows where it is. Because it's hard to conceal these things in a small place. It doesn't really matter where it is. It could have been anywhere. Maybe it could have been in England. You know, that's not my point, that this is a place in Norway, but the point is that it's a particular kind of heterogeneous, super diverse, urban environment, which is now increasingly typical of European cities, and which have to be dealt with in the context of nationalism, or in the context of national identity. What are we going to do with it? It's an anomaly in the eyes of the nation. Nothing's right. Doesn't have a deep history. It's not associated with, with nature, with agriculture, with any of these sort of traditional activities that we think about regarding, what kind of place Norway is. Whereas Kragerø is, it's quintessentially Norwegian. It's also about 10,000 people. Most of them have lived there all their lives, or in the region. Which means that if you meet someone on the high street whom you don't know, or at a party whom you don't know, which is quite rare, but it could happen. Yeah, I mean, everybody's been, to school, or your brother went to here, and your sister, had a relationship, or your father, he used to go hunting with the other guy's uncle. I mean, you have all these kinds of connections. But if you would happen to, it's a one-horse town, so there's just one main street, okay, where all the shops are, basically, pedestrian area. If you happen to meet someone whom you don't know, or at the party, or at the pub, and he would introduce himself, and he would say, okay, my name is Nilsen, okay? And then they would ask, well, are you the Nilsens from Kammerfoss, or are you the Nilsens from Jomfruland? I mean, you know that there are two Nilsen families who are not related. And then he would say, well, we are the Nilsens from, I'm the cousin of this person and so on, from Kammerfoss. Ah, well, in which case, I know who your uncle was. So it's that kind of place. Multiplex relationships. It's really the, multiplex, okay? People know each other in many different ways. And you have dense, homogeneous networks. The anthropologist Sandra Wallman wrote interestingly about this in the context of London in the 1980s, where she compared two neighbourhoods, one heterogeneous, one homogeneous. You have multiplex relationships. In other words, people tend to know each other in many ways. And in Kragerø, which is, I say, this is a quintessential, this is a metaphor for Norway, the Norwegian community. Could have been somewhere up here, okay? Could have been here, could have been here. Doesn't really matter where it is. The point is that it's a small community, and it is somehow the embodiment of the nation. The material, as it were, appearance of the nation, where everybody knows each other, where it's very cozy, it's very secure, where you have all the positive sides of this cultural intimacy, which means that people don't really have to say much, because they have a sort of an implicit understanding of each other. There's no need for intercultural skills. And there are multiplex and strong ties. So that if someone from here moves to here and gets a job at the University of Bergen and gets a student, even if he doesn't know that student personally, from that town, he would take sort of special care to make sure that this student is doing all right. He would feel a special responsibility. It's not kinship of this place. And it's similar. You see what I mean? I have a special responsibility because he's from my town. So being from the same place is important in this kind of country, as in many countries. Not in all countries, but in many countries. So you have strong ties. People do different things together. They live in the same place as they go to school, and they work largely in the same places. And when they go out in the evening, there are 3 or 4 places where they can go out, and they all would go out to the same places. At Furuset, by contrast, during the day, half of the population are not even present, because they work or they go to school somewhere else. One of the researchers on our project lives in Furuset. So he has to take the metro all the way up here to go to work at the university. And he once asked me, when we were beginning to do our fieldwork, he said that, I'm very curious to find out what it's like at Furuset during the day, between 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, because I'm never there, because he's always somewhere else. He's at work, or in town, or doing something else. And I could tell him that, well, half the people who live there are gone, but there are lots of other people who come in, who work there. So there is this transience. you can notice, if you stand outside, as I've done sometimes, you stand outside the metro station in the morning or in the afternoon, and you notice the mobility of people. And there are about as many people going out as there are coming in. So most of the people who work there, who work in the local municipal administration, for example, and who devise projects, you know, how to improve the quality of the infrastructure and so on, they would live in other parts of the city. So there is this constant feeling of flux. In addition, the fact that people move in and out quite a lot. There is this mobility. Whereas in Kragerø, as I said, as in many of these small towns and large villages, there's a very strong sense of continuity, strong sense of historical identity, and people know each other in many different ways. Okay, so in other words, the kind of self, the kind of person you become by living in Kragerø is a Norwegian person. The kind of person you become by living in Furuset is a more fragmented person with conflicting loyalties, with many partly overlapping networks, with no strong sense of rootedness, you know, in many cases anywhere. I mean, because if you were to ask these young children or adolescents who define themselves as foreigners, so, I mean, what is it like where you're from then if you're not from here? They wouldn't have a clue, because they may never have been there. You know, I mean, they may be from Somalia, but never been to Somalia. Or they may be Pakistani, but they've only been there on some very long and very boring summer holidays with grandparents. Nothing happened, you know. Just sitting around longing to get back to a place where they see themselves and are being seen by outsiders as foreign, or as not quite belonging. So it's a much more complicated kind of identification you get here. Here you get everything somehow in one place. You get, you know, kinship, you get place, you have a narrative about who you are, biography, you have the implicit culture, you have the cultural intimacy, laughing of jokes, sharing some of the same values, and so on and so forth. So, so this is a contrast that quite clearly has a bearing on the kind of community we imagine for the nation. So what I've been saying so far is that this is a kind of community which somehow is a downscaled version of the nation, whereas this is not. And this is one of the big debates, as in many European countries nowadays, trying to redefine themselves, because that's really what we're doing now. I mean, our research project was called Cultural Complexity in the New Norway, and by saying the New Norway, there's an indication here that something has changed or something is changing, and we're not quite sure what it is. But we know that it has something to do with national identity, and what is the meaning, which is a big question in all social theory. I mean, the largest question, what is the meaning of the word we? And what does the word we mean? Okay? Of course, it means lots of different things. It's situational, but you see the point. We, as a nation, what does that mean? But, and now I should perhaps, yes, I should, yeah, I'll move on to the next part of the argument in a little while, but a couple of things more. What is it that creates a sense of community? Well, as I said, it's familiarity, it's networks, it's being connected with each other, and somehow projecting this connectedness to the nation. Being from here means being part of the nation. But it has also been said by a South African anthropologist who came to Norway, and he was here on Constitution Day, the 17th of May. Great day. It's a field day for any anthropologist. You know, I mean, there was a Swedish ethnologist who wrote a book about the 17th of May, and it took her a long time because it only happens once a year. You see, and she wanted to do fieldwork in Oslo, in Stavanger, in Bergen, in some of the main cities, but also in a couple of small places. So she had to come back, you know, every year, and then finally she wrote the book. So that's a big day of celebration. It's very interesting because it is, according to quantitative social scientists, something like 94% of the population celebrate the 17th of May in one way or another. 94%. I mean, that's not, I mean, in some other countries where I've done fieldwork, they have national days, but they don't take them seriously. Whereas here, it's very much, we're very much talking about the nationalism from below. And there are speeches in local communities, okay? Everywhere there is a speech on the 17th of May, and there are two ingredients which are always present. One of them is the sacrifices that were made during the Second World War, which was a big sort of ritual, I mean, a big sort of ritual event in modern Norwegian history, Second World War. It has been calculated that something like 80% of the books that have been written about so-called modern Norwegian history are about the Second World War. Which means that every person who was in the resistance has had this biography written at least once. You see, I mean, that's how national history is being made. So it's a very big day. But what this anthropologist discovered when he was in Norway on the 17th of May was not national cohesion, but rather fragmentation. He said that. And now I'm moving to the second part of my argument, okay? He was saying that, no, it looks like a tribal society. Because of the prevalence of fortresses. Because these fortresses are not generically national. They're from a small place. They're all regional. And there's a very strict grammar, informal set of rules regarding who is entitled to wear which fortress. And there's been, I mean, just like the hijab has spread among Muslims in the last 25 years, the fortress has spread in the same way, and largely for the same reasons among Norwegian women. So almost everybody has one now. Very expensive garments. And there's a strong sort of set of cultural rules regarding who's entitled to wear which one. You have to have a connection to the place. So if you don't have relatives in West Telemark, which is up here, which is one of the heartlands of national romanticism, it's just too bad. You cannot wear a West Telemark fortress. You're not allowed to. Well, you can buy it in a shop, but everybody would know they were fake. But if one of your parents came from there, although you've never been there yourself, you're still entitled to. You can do it, you know. You can do it. So you see, it's a highly interesting sort of cultural notions around this. But that's a different lecture, so I'm not going to give it now. But the point is that he said that it's like a tribal society because everybody has their own distinctive regional identity, and they're very conscious about it, and people are very conscious about the dialects. And it's not considered a good thing to lose your dialect when you move to town. You know, that is considered a sign of bad character. So it's because it's somehow rejecting your own origins, changing your dialect. So that's one thing. I mean, this sort of community tribal. I'm coming back to that in a little while, because I now move to the second part of the argument. I said very few of the minority children wear a folk dress. They would wear other kinds of clothes. But they still celebrate the National Day, and they wave their little Norwegian flags. There's been some controversy around this. This is a footnote, okay? But there's been some controversy around this. But it illustrates perhaps some of the dilemmas we have when we now try to redefine the nations in order to accommodate this kind of diversity. Because if we don't, you're going to end up in a country where 10% of the population or more are going to continue to feel foreign. There was a debate around the use of flags during the National Day. For a long time, all the flags were just the Norwegian flag, which is cross flag. I mean, it's all the way in the Scandinavian tradition, you know, it's actually a Danish flag superimposed on the Swedish one, which is an official secret back home. We don't talk about that, but that's what it is. That's how it came about in the 19th century, when Norway was struggling culturally and politically to define its own identity as distinctive from Denmark and Sweden, the colonial powers in the region. For a long time, all flags were Norwegian. Then, after the 1950s, someone came up with the idea that maybe United Nations flags would also be nice. So there were a few UN flags, you know, to symbolize global solidarity, for which Norway was trying to market itself, you know, as one of its trademarks. Way back into the mists of oblivion, and on the one hand, where, I mean, many of the people who come from Prague, they would have family names, which are also names of local places, you know, from islands, from little sort of nooks and crannies in the region, so they have this deep history. And some of them even have family names which could be recognized on street names in the town, because these are families which have lived for centuries, perhaps, in gardens. Deep history. Perfect for nation building. Whereas Furuset has its sprawling, transnational, hectic, nervous kind of identity, where people are not quite sure who they are. They don't have this sort of fixed identity. So which serves as the best model for the nation? Now, I'm spending a little more than 45 minutes, not much. Because there's one thing I need to say before I move on to the second part of the argument. I'm going to do much faster than the first part, okay? Which is that one typical complaint in multicultural communities in Norway, as elsewhere, is the fact that many people of minority backgrounds do not contribute to communal activities. Okay, communal activities. There's a key term in Norway. It was voted the national word. Yeah, people are crazy about national things. It was voted the national word, and that is a word which they claim doesn't exist in any other language. Okay, and which represents communal work when people come together to, to tidy up the basement of the local flats, or to do something together. Okay, or you sell hot dogs for the children's football team. Every parent has to come. And do this. And the word is dugnad. Okay, dugnad. Which it's true that the word doesn't exist in any other language. It doesn't even exist in Swedish, but the phenomenon, of course, exists in lots of places. Communal work, when people come together. And there were complaints that many of these minority parents, they never showed up. They never came to the dugnad. For example, their children were active in sport, but the parents never drove them to away matches, or and they never turned up to sell hot dogs on Sundays, and so on. And we looked into this, and we found that the main explanation is that there is a tension here between place and kinship, which has a bearing on personhood, on how you see yourself as a person. Because when they didn't show up, and they didn't take part in these communal activities, it could have something to do with gender segregation. The mother couldn't, for religious or cultural reasons. She could, or maybe for religious reasons, she couldn't sell hot dogs anyway because they contained pig. The fathers couldn't do it for two reasons. They had 3 jobs, and they had kinship obligations. So whenever they had a few hours off, they had to drive off to see some family somewhere else. Okay, the brother, the cousins, etc. Which the Norwegians did, living in nuclear families, more isolated. So that's one. In other words, that makes every anthropologist think that, well, we're here talking about the sociocentric person. The sociocentric person, the person who sees himself not as an individual, but as embedded in a social fabric, okay, based on kinship, which doesn't fit with the idea of a nation, where there's a kind of umbilical cord, right, between me and the nation, and everything between is noise. I should be connected directly to the nation, or to the dugnad, as it were, as the embodiment of what that means. As the exemplification of what it means to be part of the nation. So having a parochial identity seems to be in conflict with being a full member of the nation. And now I move on to the last part of the argument, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. I have now said that there are certain things about the construction of personhood in Furuset, this multi-ethnic area, which seems to not fit too well with the grammar of national integration, national identity. They have transnational obligations towards kin, in Pakistan, in Somalia, and so on. Some of the Turkish parents even never watched Norwegian TV, so there are lots of generational conflicts. This can be recognized over in Europe, I think. They want to watch Turkish TV programs. And there are even, in some of these housing cooperatives, conflicts over whether or not they should be allowed to have a satellite dish, because really they're not allowed to have satellite dishes. Okay? They've got cable television. Well, they can get all the Scandinavian and a few foreign channels, but no Turkish. But they need satellite dishes to get the Turkish channels. So they're having conflicts over this, whether or not to allow these satellite dishes. And within the family, there are conflicts between the parents and the children about whether they should watch Turkish on Norwegian TV, and the children tell their parents, look, I mean, you people never want to integrate. You only think about your family, and you still have your head in Turkey. I mean, you're never going to be a sort of good member of this community. And the father would sort of grumble a bit and say, well, all right, who pays the bill? You know, who pays for your education? You know, and so on. Who buys your clothes? Shut up, you know. And they would get this kind of very classic argument. And now I move on to the next part of the argument, because what I'm going to say is that paradoxically, perhaps, Furuset as a locality is as a community probably a better model for the new nation than Krakow. Okay, why am I saying this? Okay. And I'm going to try to persuade you. And if you're not persuaded, I'll be happy to get objections. In the second generation, the first generation, it's true, they have a construction of a person which doesn't really fit with the nation. Where there is a weak loyalty towards the nation, a weak sense of belonging, with many exceptions, but on the whole. And this only stands to reason. I mean, if you move to a new country as an adult, and certainly if that is a country which has a very strong cultural nationalist identity, it would be hard for you. You have difficulty, you struggle with the language, like this Somali mother. You struggle with the language, you find that the food is strange. There's hardly anything you can eat. I mean, you hear stories about African refugees in Danish villages who walk into the local supermarket and they can't find anything they can eat. Everything is alien and sort of dangerous. And there are many other things. But by the time we reach the second generation, something very interesting happens. Namely that this kinship-oriented person is somehow transformed in the space of one generation into an individual. Okay? If you don't mind my using these slightly dated terms for the sake of the argument, the sociocentrism. It's my community, and my community is not the national one. My community is not the national one. It can be religion, but it's largely based on kinship. And it's deterritorialized to some extent, because some of the people I have commitments towards live in another country. So there's a move from, documented, a move from sociocentrism to individualism in the space of one generation. Which means that the second generation, I mean, one member, as I just mentioned to Durkhan as we were having tea, one member of this second generation, she's now the Minister of Culture in the country. And speaks with a characteristic southwest Norwegian dialect. It's very hard, you know, to write her off as an invading foreigner when you speak with that kind of dialect. The heterogeneous in the heterogeneous suburb, you find that there is a way of dealing with difference which has been developed over a few decades. I just read a piece of research from a part of London where something similar seems to have been taking place. We could discuss that also later on. In Krakow, you have these dense homogeneous networks, which means that you can take a lot of things for granted. Cultural similarity can be taken for granted. Here you have these scattered and heterogeneous. And you have here you have in Krakow you have a lot of strong ties. Strong ties. Which means that if you want to go somewhere, as I said, if you go to Bergen to study, if there is a teacher there or someone who works in the university who is from your hometown, that is a big asset. Almost like a first generation Pakistani, when he comes home to the Punjab, he feels like, well, I'm among my own. And similarly here, Whereas the people who live here in the second generation are now distinguishing between the first and the second, because the first generation came as adults and they've got their own sort of challenges to deal with. They develop weak ties all over the place. So, in other words, and they have they've developed intercultural skills, which means that they become extremely skillful at negotiating between different cultural contexts, translating between different contexts. And the glue that ties them together is thin. It's a very thin kind of integration. But it may be sufficient. It's like the kind of integration you get when you agree about stopping at traffic lights, abiding by the law, and voting. And apart from that, the lonely Norwegian man who plays World of Warcraft doesn't really care what his neighbour does. Why should he? In other words, there is here, you might say here there is concern, there's moral concern. If anybody, say a 17-year-old boy who's not supposed to drink, if he gets drunk on a Friday, on the next day everybody will know. And they try to make sure that it's not going to happen again. There's concern here, whereas here there is indifference. And I think there is something to be said for indifference. Okay? In these contexts. There's indifference, but there is also, I mean, a term which has been introduced also by some colleagues of mine who've been working in similar places and been working with civility. Okay? Which means that here, in this kind of environment, you can be a flexible individual. You can shift between different kinds of social situations. You have lots of weak ties because it is sometimes said about these suburbs that they are ghettos, and it may be the case in one or two cities. I mean, that you have ghettos in the sense that you have these closed suburbs where people hardly ever go out. I mean, we heard after the riots in France some years ago that there were people who lived in these working class suburbs with many people from North Africa that they lived in Paris all their lives and they'd never seen the Eiffel Tower. Well, you would not have people who have lived in Fuset all their lives who have never seen the fjord, which is things you see in Oslo, because they take the metro all the time. They go to school, they get educated, they work in other parts of the city. Where they do something in the evening, they may stay there and they play football or ice hockey, or then they go somewhere else to go to the cinema, where they encounter other people. So we get these overlapping, heterogeneous kinds of social systems, whereas if you're stuck in a small community, although it is the best metaphorical representation of the nation, because it's a community. My examples were intended to show that downscaling the nation, thinking that since the nation is an imagined community, a real community must be the best representation of the nation, is wrong. It's not true. Downscaling doesn't work in this case. Because when you downscale it, what you get is an isolate and a place with little mobility, with few of those social skills that you're actually going to need to maneuver in this kind of universe. So when we spoke about cultural complexity in the new Norway, there was a lot of debate within the group. I mean, anthropologists really like sort of to undermine their own theories. Some of our colleagues didn't like the word cultural, because culture is such a difficult term. It's become an impossible term to use. It's being misused by so many people involved in identity. They didn't like complexity either. Particularly one of my PhD students, she really didn't like complexity, because when you say that something is complex, it's really an offense to everybody else, because then you say that something else is simple. So everything is complex. New. Now, they didn't like new either, because, I mean, as one person said, well, we know quite a bit about the cultural complexity of the new Norway, because we have so much identity politics, first with the indigenous people, then with the national minorities, and now with immigrants. What we want to know about is the cultural complexity of the old Norway. In fact, that the country was a lot more complex than historians have led us to believe before. And finally, Norway, methodological nationalism. I mean, why limit yourself to studying one country? So the only word we were left with was in. You know, nobody objected to that. So this is, I mean, but this kind of debate that we had that debate in a serious way when we started out on the project many years ago, and it illustrates the difficulties we have by trying to make the concepts fit reality. So what we were trying to do, and what I've been trying to do now in a modest way, is to begin to redraw the maps of our countries. National identities are not going away. Okay, they're not going away. They're not going to be replaced. I mean, that's one of the things that, one of the lessons we learned from studies of globalization is that globalization does not create global people. And mobility does not create people who don't feel belonging to who don't have a sense of place. Okay? It doesn't. So the next question would then be, okay, what kind of place is this? And how can that reality of that place be reconciled with the ideas you have about the nation? I think that in every country there is potential for devising or for adjusting or for defining a national identity, not necessarily based on similarity, but on diversity. And since this South African anthropologist, this was in the innocent early 1980s that he came, his name is Julian Kramer, and he still works as an anthropologist in the civil service. When he spoke of the country as a tribal country, a tribal place, he pointed out, in fact, that there is a lot of pre-existing diversity, but it's unmarked. It's not thought about as diversity. And as a matter of fact, if someone down here, I mean, what I'm talking about now is the pre-existing diversity and the need for intercultural skills to maneuver in a complex society. The kind of skill and the need for weak ties in order to get around. In other words, a kind of complexity you learn by living in this deeply stigmatized, working class, eastern Oslo, noisy, industrial, full of Muslims place called Furuset, and which you don't get by living in one of these quintessential communities that somehow are being used in postcards and in tourism to represent Norway. If someone lives down here and he doesn't drink alcohol, never serves alcohol, okay? He refuses his daughters to go out dancing. And he's against sex before marriage. And he's in favor of banning pornography. Not considered culturally different from a majority, not considered diverse, but is sometimes even invited into government. Whereas there's someone up here, because this guy's name is Hylland Eriksen, okay? There's someone up here whose name is Abdullah Mohammed, and he says, I will not serve alcohol at home, and my daughters should not go out dancing, and I think pornography should be banned, okay? I'm really against homosexuality and sex before marriage. I think that's horrible. Then that is being written off as being a kind of cultural difference that we really cannot live with in this liberal society, that we really cannot tolerate, because it's simply too much at odds with the values on which we build our society. So what I'm saying is that if first we discover the pre-existing diversity, we then see that the heterogeneous suburb is in fact probably more in line with the real existing nation than the dense homogeneous community. One thing that I haven't spoken about, and maybe we can do that during discussion depending on what you'd like to, is what kind of person is it really? The individual. What kind of person is it? Is it a neoliberal consumer? Are we talking about this? Or are we talking about something else? At least we can say that the kind of person who is compatible with the nation is not the sociocentric. And this is where in my abstract, I mean, I didn't speak from the abstract, this is where the anthropologist Louis Dumont comes in. Because Louis Dumont, who was a specialist on India, and he had some rather rigid ideas, I think, about the difference between Indians and Europeans. He had good arguments, but he had this sort of French, sort of rationalist attitude. But when he spoke about communalism and nationalism, his main point was that with communalism, your first and last loyalty goes towards your community, which is based on frequently on kinship or on, in the case of India, religion. Whereas with nationalism, you're an individual. So the nationalism, the nation, is, as it says, it's a community. It's a collective individual and a collective of individuals. So that's where the transition takes place in my analysis between the first and the second generation of minorities in this area is a transition to individualism. That the people we speak to, and we have a research project right now on young adults between 18 and 25, and we try to find out about the prospects and how they see, I'm finishing now, how they see their future lives. They would say, even the covered up Somali girls would say, I want to, I want to become a nurse, They wouldn't say, my family wants me to, which is a very different thing. And the former is perfectly compatible with this idea of the nation. You see what I mean? Scattered heterogeneous speak ties networks. The other one, probably not.
Thanks very much for your incredibly enlightening and enjoyable presentation. So now the stage is open for discussion. If you have your questions, do you like to take them one by one?
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
When I was listening to the second part of your talk, I was reminded of Durkheim's work on solidarity.
Yes.
And I wondered whether, it's probably true that the mechanical solidarity based on sameness is the village down on the coast, and then you have the organic solidarity. But the question the nationalist would pose for the conclusion is, what is the source of solidarity in a community that is very diverse?
Yes. Excellent. That is the big question, isn't it? It's a variety of questions on what is the meaning of the word we. And yes, I've also been often reminded of Durkheim when thinking about these things. Mechanical solidarity, which he associates with traditional society, with a very limited division of labour, where you somehow feel at one with your labour because you do the same thing. Whereas in organic solidarity, I feel as an academic a great relief that I don't have to be a plumber, so I can actually get someone, to fix my kitchen fittings and stuff when something goes wrong. With the organic solidarity, the source of yes, we've been trying to look at this. To some extent, one gets quite a lot in common merely by living in the same place, in terms of culture. So cultural differences in these diverse areas are often exaggerated because we're looking for what is different and not for that which is similar, which is often very substantial. But that does not really help concerning your self-identification. Who do I feel at one point? In a country like Mauritius, where I've been working before, people have a lot in common culturally, but they're not necessarily aware of it, because there has been this obsession with cultural difference. So they see the differences and not the similarities. They discover the similarities when they come to Europe. And then they realize, wow, I've got so much in common with other Mauritians. And there are even Mauritians who claim that they can tell if someone is Mauritian on the street by body language and that's all. I don't think it's true, but there are people who claim it. So, but that doesn't help if your identity, your self-understanding is taking you somewhere else. I think shared experiences, maybe having gone through some kind of ordeal. The Second World War was a big it was a big boost for Norwegian nationalism. The nation had been very divided in the 1930s, so that the people who celebrated May Day, 1st of May, the workers' day of struggle, did not celebrate the 17th of May, which they saw as being treason to the working class, because there was vertical solidarity with the bourgeoisie. Whereas after 1945, everyone went to the national celebration because they'd gone through this ordeal together. And in Norway, less than 2 years ago, we had this terrible terrorist attack from the right-wing terrorists, who killed 77 people, some of them with a minority background. Some of the people who were at that summer camp, organized by the Young Labour, had a minority background and had Muslim names. And there was a feeling in the weeks afterwards that now that one had gone through this crisis and emerged out of it, there was a strong sense of commonality which cut across ethnic boundaries. So having some shared experiences that have made a difference, maybe having gone through some sense of crisis and come out of it together, that sort of thing could create a sense of being we. it's always a good idea, as you know. I mean, all identities are relational. So being capable of comparing yourself to someone else. You know, we are standing up against the Swedes or the, whatever. Yes. That's the beginning. I mean, it's not the final answer, but it's beginning to reflect. Yes, please. Gabriella first.
Well, I have lots of questions. I'll
Yeah,
start with two, maybe, yeah. I just wanted to ask you, the weak ties on a national level, can we equate that necessarily with indifference on the local level? And I also thought, in terms of, ethnic community organization, in terms of the expressions of we and identity politics and Putnam's bonding and bridging, I just thought it would be very interesting. How is, between these ethnic communities, the expression of we in terms of organizations?
Yes, good, very, very good question, very complicated question.
Yes, you can pick it.
Yes, I mean, the weak ties, yes. Because perhaps sometimes one gets the feeling that in order to have anything at all in common, you've got to have everything in common. I mean, you place the threshold so high that in order to be allowed in, you have to love cross-country skiing. I mean, you have to. I mean, there's lots of things you have to do, which is very, very hard for foreigners. I mean, in Amsterdam, they have courses, for Somali women to learn to ride a bike because they feel like in order to live in this society, I mean, you have to. Of course, you have to ride a bike. That's part of being human, And maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they should reconcile themselves with the fact that. I mean, Jon Elster once said, the social philosopher, that a society is a place where people stop at red traffic lights. That's a very minimal definition of a society. And we have to do better than that. The question is, how much better? Maybe it's enough that you cheer for the same football team. I mean, what was it in the early 90s? The Clement, the Clement.
I don't think
people don't like
that.
Yes, but I think, but what I'm getting at is really that maybe weak ties are sufficient. Maybe weak ties in fact can be sufficient because of a variety of reasons. And it is also very odd that the practice of remittances, sending remittances, is considered a problem in European countries. But the same European countries say give foreign aid to the same countries. Whereas the practice of sending remittances is seen as being problematic because it shows that people are not fully settled there. So maybe one should also reconcile oneself with the fact of transnationalism.
I grew up in an area of London which sounds fairly similar to Brosep in South London, where it's very diverse, lots of communities from all over the world. And while you were talking, I was trying to think about what it is that I kind of developed as a sense of place there. And really I felt that it wasn't a national sense of place, it was quite a local sense of place, and it was very much defined by South London versus North London. It was a sense of, we belong here because we're South London, and they over there they're different because they're from North London. And that was true across all of the different ethnic groups there. But it also brought up for me something possibly problematic, because you've also got in a lot of areas of London now what we're calling postcode wars. So, groups of young people who feel completely tied to their postcode but aren't actually able to go into other areas as well. So there's a problem there with the idea of this creating a sense of place as defined against somebody else, and that then potentially being a barrier rather than a help to getting a bigger, possibly national identity.
Yes, that's right. Yes, very, very well put. Yeah, I was going to say something about that. In fact, that somehow slipped my mind that many of the young people at Furuset, who we know, and who've lived there maybe all their lives, they feel very attached to that place, but they find it very hard to identify with Norway. And so that's very, it's a very simple thing. They might even feel that they identify with Eastern Oslo, similarly to what you're saying about London, as opposed to the hopeless sort of snobs on the west side, who wear different clothes, listen to different music, and really haven't understood what life is about, because they're all sort of interested in the wrong things. But the short answer is that if you have overlapping, I mean, as many overlapping commitments and conflicting loyalties as you can, you know, it tends to help. But of course, if you invest everything in your sort of locality or network, I mean, if you get these sort of very dense homogeneous, I think Sandra Walden wrote really well about this in the 1980s, where she compared two parts of London. One which was very homogeneous, people lived in the same area, you know, their wives, you know, their children and so on. And then you had sort of Battersea, which was a bit more like this, you know, where in fact the entrance ticket was very cheap, because you only had to move in. And then you were part of the local community, but it didn't offer much in return either. So there may be a freedom-security trade-off here as well, right? But in the other part of London, as she was writing about, in the Tower Hamlets region at the time, early 1980s, there were ethnic gangs. You know, there were people who wouldn't see eye to eye to each other. I mean, people who were afraid of each other. And they were basically very innocent to what you're saying. So something intermediate here, something intermediate might be a way of thinking about this, in terms of social integration. Yes?
Also, what do you think makes the both place and kinship sort of symbolism identity stronger than the other ones? Because what I notice it's usually triumphs over other, because, for example, academics are scattered, right? Different interests, different people who play tennis and things, but you still don't identify with them, don't have, even though you do have short experience, rituals, where you use games and things, maybe apart from football, it might be sometimes an exception. Still, the sort of national usually triumphs over other forms of solidarity and identity. And I was wondering, could you sort of see why this symbolism, even if a person has lived away, for example, of the place?
Yes, it's an interesting, it's a very big question. But I think it is because, you know, I think, you know, that's one thing, you know, Benedict Hansen says in the first chapter of Magic Communities. He said that, I mean, maybe someone says it in passing, he doesn't really pursue it, that nationalism has less in common with ideologies such as liberalism and socialism than with phenomena such as religion and kinship. In other words, that when it works, it's deeply emotional. And what they're telling you, I mean, what nationalist ideology tells you is that you've got this person, okay? And you have this set of emotion, because it's emotional, right? It's not here, it's here. And you love your family, and the place you grew up, and so on, and so forth. And what they tell you is that, well, those were obvious any persons you grew up with, or in your own place, because it was a Norwegian place, and a Norwegian persons, and therefore you should love your nation. And if you don't, you know, you betray your childhood memories, because your childhood memories are national. But why that works so well? Well, it doesn't always work well. It doesn't work well in Italy.
Yeah, but do you think it might have something to do, again, with the sort of mystification, like the degree of emotions instead of reason? Because, for example, people who are bound by a certain ideology think critically about it, but they don't think as much critically about those emotional things.
No, because there's no simple answer to this, and I cannot say why, but I'm sure other people in the audience might. But it has something to do with the way in which it attaches itself to your emotional life and to the way you see yourself as a person. Who am I, you know? And who is the primary we? My childhood memories, the place I grew up, my family, and they are part of that nation. One category of people who should be sort of studied more, and we should think more about, are the people who are half and half. Okay? There's very little research on those. There's a lot of research, I mean, certainly in the European context, of various minorities and even cultural hybridity. But in certain parts of Oslo, not in Furuset, but in certain parts of inner eastern Oslo, quite a few children, maybe more than half, have one Norwegian and one foreign parent. And what kind of sort of national identity do they get? Well, certainly a more complicated. But no, I don't have another answer than what I've given you. But maybe someone else will. Yeah. Yes.
What about, I mean, the notion of place and kinship are quite abstract in themselves, and can mantle with all kinds of identities other than national.
Yes.
So the part of having a national identity is, to some extent, institutional too, whether you're included are excluded from non-institutional education, civil service, political parties, and so forth.
Yes.
So what about these second generation or third generation immigrants? To what extent are they part of any kind of institutional mainstream?
Yes, they are to a great extent. I mean, they get, they have, in fact, higher level of secondary education than higher education than ethnic Norwegians, because to them something is at stake, and they take what we call the hourly subjects. I mean, they become, the hourly subject. They become lawyer, doctor, and engineer.
Is that across all the various groups? There might be some variation.
I'm talking largely about Pakistan.
Yeah.
Okay, there are variations, but by and large, they are included to a great extent than in many other countries because Norway is doing so well economically. So there are jobs, for virtually everybody. But I mean, let's think about the counterexamples, the places in the world where nationalism doesn't work. I mean, take Afghanistan. I mean, the attempt to create a national identity there, where you have very strong kinship-based and clan-based identities, or Somalia, virtually the only ethnically homogeneous country in all of Africa, and also the only country which has really fallen apart. And not because of cultural difference, not because of religion or race, but because of a different mode of, as you say, I mean, attaching yourself to a place in kinship. It's a different way of doing that. Or Libya, which is also not really a functioning nation in the sense that people feel at one with the imagined community of Libyans. So there's no automatic, and I think yes, the institutional dimension is very important because it offers something. In the past, it would have been offered in your locality, it would have been offered in Prague. You would have gotten your career there, someone to marry, a place to live, security, a job, a future. Whereas nowadays, it's been that kind of imaginary has been projected onto this abstract national scale, and increasingly transnational. That's also why I'm saying that maybe these transnational communities are more sort of in line with the 21st century than the more anchored and rooted ones. Lots of people want to, yes?
I can see how seductive it can be to, and it is, to say that, the big ties represent more or better this new Norway, as opposed to, this old ties, and that, in fact, and how provocative it sounds to say that apparently the second generation immigrants represent better this new Norway than the ethnic Norwegians. And I really like what you said, that the question would be how to, at the moment you have like both types of ties coexisting. So how do you make sense of a nation where these two kind of types of nation coexist or live together, sharing the place?
Yes, it's a big issue. And we're only beginning to think about it, okay? But let's say that somewhere between these, and as I intimate that, at the end of my talk, maybe what we're really talking about here is the neoliberal individual. If meritocracy, which is an extreme form of liberal individualism, and which is never sort of fully achieved anywhere, but if you get the perfect meritocratic society based on individual sort of skill, ambition, and so on, where people are sort of primed to become skilled consumers and producers in a competitive individualist society, then this system based on weak ties will work. But of course, in practice, you always have the sort of the strength of cultural intimacy and all these other things pulling you back. Yes, yes. But it's a matter of finding a balance here. And the way the world is moving now, I would say that most of our societies are moving from here to here, and we have to find a way of dealing with that. But of course, it's provocative. I couldn't say this back home without receiving death threats. I mean, being critical of nationalism in a country like that makes you always feel like you're an atheist in a Muslim country. You see, anyway, yes, please.
I'm interested to know how much your national cultural institutions, your national museums represent the nation.
Yes.
And obviously, most school trips, all kids go to the museums to find out about the language. Does Norway's cultural institutions still do the foundation of the scenario? Are the Sami represented, for instance?
Yeah. That's a good question, and it's a big one. And it would have been interesting here to develop some contrasts between Norway and Sweden. Because in Sweden, one has redefine the nation very much in multiculturalist terms. You know, I mean, also in Denmark, they make jokes about the Swedes all the time because they're so sanctimonious and politically correct. You know? Whereas Norway is somewhere between, you know, somewhere intermediate between the Swedish and the Danish situation in this respect. There have been a few attempts. For example, there's an outdoor museum at Bygdøy in Oslo, an outdoor museum representing rural culture from various periods in various parts of the country. And they've now included an immigrant flat from the 1970s. You see, typical Pakistani flat, you know, full of Christmas decorations and gaudy colours and, you know, that sort of thing. Because, you know, this is now part of our history, is the argument. So there are some, weak attempts to try to adjust this. But I find this very interesting for a variety of reasons, and also because a few years ago a 3-volume work was published by a number of historians and sociologists called A History of Immigration to Norway. And they didn't just start in the 1970s, or in the 1950s, when we got the first sort of Hungarians after 1956, but they started in the 9th century. Okay? History of immigration starting in the 9th century, showing that every time something remotely interesting has happened in the country, foreigners have been involved. There has been this kind of interchange. Several of the Viking kings were born in the Baltic states. They weren't even Norwegian. But they said they had, just like in, I mean, I know if you watch Game of Thrones, I mean, they had a claim to the throne. And they came, and they fought their battle and won, and became kings. And got the Norwegian name just such as Hylland, but they were actually from the Baltics. So they show that the history of Norway is the history of transnational connections. And to me, this was not just a history of immigration, it was an alternative way of narrating the history of the country. So yes, there is something going on there. But probably not enough. Well, that's up to other people to decide. But as someone said, I mean, to me, you know, why study the cultural complexity of the new Norway? We should be looking more at the cultural complexity of the old Norway. And some people have done so. Yeah. But on the whole, the myths are being retold. There was a very popular film just a few years ago about one of the resistance heroes from the Second World War. And you know, the story of the resistance has been made more complicated in some European countries. In the Netherlands, for example, where there have been, you know, books and films about, for example, love affairs between Dutch girls and German soldiers, which happened in Norway as well, but it's still surrounded by shame. The fact that some of these girls had children by Nazi soldiers and so on. So this film, which was hugely popular about 3 years ago, it told the central myth of the occupation and the resistance, basically along the same lines as it would have been told in 1946. With no revisions. Okay. So there's the continuity. Yeah. Yes?
Your talk made me think about the ways that nation states determine who can belong and who can't. So who can be the we and who can't in terms of citizenship regimes and naturalisation regimes. And I was thinking, what happens if you replace person in your diagram with citizen?
Yes.
And linking that back to the way nations administer kind of who can belong in terms of jus soli and jus sanguinis. So
yes,
absolutely. Blood and kinship and place. Just
absolutely.
Really.
Yes, obviously. I mean, the jus solis and the jus sanguinis is, you know, it's place and kinship. It's the two ways of thinking about what does it mean to belong. Is it because we live in the same place, or is it because we have the same ancestors? And those two ways of posing the question would generate very different answers. Regarding citizenship, I mean, if we're interested in the sort of fuzzy boundaries around nations nowadays, exploring dual citizenship would be interesting. I mean, who accepts it and who doesn't? There's been a swing. I mean, in the 1990s, there was an increase, you know, in the number of countries in Europe that accepted dual citizenship, and now many of them have somehow changed their minds. So I think Sweden is the only one now of the Nordic countries which still accepts dual citizenship. But being a citizen is not enough. I mean, that's not really. I mean, it's an interesting topic. It's not really the topic of my talk. It's more like what goes on in civil society. Being a citizen isn't enough, although it helps, and certainly when you live in a welfare state. Yes.
Yeah, you're saying that this immigrant suburb Furuset, that's a better picture of Norway today and even more so tomorrow's Norway than Kragerø was the
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking that what perhaps Nydrogen is a very good picture because the majority of Norwegians would live like in suburbs which are fairly ethnically homogeneous. So that would be the kind of places that most Norwegians would live in. Then those places have some characteristics of Furuset, like the indifference and weak ties. And so it's not like people get upset if some 17-year-old can stroll the trunk. So that would be like the normal middle class suburb. But they also have some characteristics of Kragerø, and that it's fairly ethnically homogeneous. Yeah. There are immigrants, but they are well integrated and so on. So I think it's a little bit of a false dilemma. Like either Furuset or
Yeah, well, those were the two places where I got my material from, okay? But, so that was a contrast I felt like making, but also in the context of debating.
Exactly, no, I understand that.
What should the nation be at the level of national imagery? It is absolutely true what you say. I mean, just like in most other sort of affluent Western societies, and many people do not necessarily feel a strong sense of attachment to where they live. I mean, urbanization has taken place really fast in Norway, a bit later than in Sweden. When the northern half of Sweden was basically depopulated, more or less. And people told out, well, you can move down and we'll give you a job in the industry in Nederland or in Göteborg. But we can't feed you if you're going to continue to that. Whereas in Norway, urbanization has taken place somewhat later. But this means that lots of people live in these fairly nondescript suburban areas where they don't feel a strong sense of attachment. It's true. But that level of symbolism, the small community where everybody knows everybody, is seen as the ideal, the Gemeinschaft. And the idea is still very strong that the good life is either in a small town or in the country. But then why does nobody want to live there? I mean, one thing I didn't mention about Calgary is that they have a problem, like in many of these small towns, where maybe the main sort of industry has been closed down, so there isn't much work. And it's been closed down because of South Korean competition. Now, the shipyard, everything has been outsourced to East Asia and you can't get a job as a sailor. The last Norwegian sailor probably dates back to the late 1970s. Since then, all the officers are Norwegian, and all the sailors are Filipinos and from other countries. So in other words, people move out, young people move out, and they don't come back. It's not in Sweden you got for living. The countryside. That old people predominate. So yes, but at the level of national imagery, it's a community, it's a Gemeinschaft.
Yeah. But is that a little bit special for Norway? I come from Sweden, which you recognize, I think. So we don't
I suspected that.
No, but we don't really have those like Gemeinschaft community in the same. We have, of course, national imagery. So it strikes me that Norway is a little bit special in this regard.
I think Sweden is more comparable to Britain. Because Sweden doesn't really have a national identity, but an imperial identity. So it's more, each Sweden is being the universal human. I realise this is a big topic, okay? No, but if you take the Swedish national anthem, Sweden is not mentioned. Jag vill leva, jag vill dö i Norden. I shall live, I shall die in Norden, in the north, yeah. Implicitly, our home is Sweden plus these little stupid countries surrounding it. Sorry about that. No, but there are some very important, I think, differences in the grammars of national identity, which is quite clear. In Sweden, national identity in the 20th century was forward-looking, it was future-oriented. Sweden was the America of the North, whereas in Norway it was backwards-looking, romanticizing the rural life and seeing, as the rural community as the main as a place where you can have a good life. And in this it resembles the nationalism you find in Slovakia, in some of the Baltic states, in some of those smaller countries between, you might say, the big empires, between the German and the Russian. And Sweden is an exception because Sweden had its own empire.
Thank you. We have just 5 minutes left, so one last very quick question and answer.
Yeah, I think it was you first, yeah.
I wanted to ask, how does the sense of community differ in the small town where everyone knows each other, and in the bigger industrial towns where the relations are anonymous individuals? Is it in the more rural areas? Is it more a sense of ethnicity, and in the urban areas more a sense of nationality, or how is it?
Well, it's there's a simple answer, but yes, I would say that in the small town, if I may use an obsolete term, what is dysfunctional about the small town in the current situation is that the people who spend years there, they get very few of these weak ties. In other words, there are few ways of getting out. It can be secure to be inside, but there are few avenues of mobility out of it. Whereas here you have a weak integration with you've got lots of sort of tentacles pointing in different directions, even transnational. Whether it's ethnicity or something else, it's a critical question, and it depends. But there are situations, there are contexts, okay, even here, where ethnicity may be crucial. And the problem in Furuset, I haven't spoken about that, but that's another lecture again. The main problem seen by other people who live there is the fact that there are too many Pakistanis, that the Pakistani are more than 50%. Which means that whenever something happens, a public event of some kind, many others feel that it's dominated by the Pakistanis. In that respect, yes, and they are very often connected through kin ties and same origins and so on. From the same parts of Pakistan and Punjab. Most Norwegian Pakistani come from a very small cluster of villages, about halfway between Islamabad and Lahore. And you can go there, and you can notice, that there are people there who you can almost stop people on the street and speak Norwegian to them. Because there's such a critical mass of people in some of these towns who have lived in Norway, and who have come back. Yes?
I'm just curious how Norway has differentiated itself. You noted that Sweden was an imperial power, and thus has not identified itself in the same way as Norway. How has Norway differentiated itself from Sweden and Denmark, and how has it differentiated itself from the rest of Europe?
Yeah.
And how has that changed with the influx of immigration?
Yeah, good question. Great question, because, and this is useful. I see you laughing. But the short answer is that the fact that there hasn't really been any serious ethnic rise, and the fact that integration is on the whole going rather well. In the sense that the second generation, they get educated, they get jobs. There is a bit of discrimination, and there's a bit of Islamophobia, but not as bad as in many other places. It's a bit of a miracle when you look at the historical origins of Norwegian nationalism as a very romantic kind of ethnic nationalism, as opposed to what we had in Sweden, and even in Denmark, where it was very urban. Danish nationalism centered around Copenhagen, which was a cosmopolitan city, and had been for centuries. It was Norwegian's capital. Whereas we had nothing. We didn't have a proud military history. We didn't have a proud cultural history. We had to go to Denmark even to get our books published. Henrik Ibsen had to go to Copenhagen because that's where the publishers were. So it was a remote periphery, and with a very strong sense of ethnic, cultural, rooted, historically based identity. So that's why I'm saying that the transition to an urban, multicultural society with no more, as it were, serious crises and difficulties that we've had is almost a miracle. And it's quite interesting how, that's an issue for really comparative historians of nationalism, how from very different sources, nations which have very, very different histories, can end up with pretty much the same results, similar results. If you take the debates, some of the debates that we've been touching upon during this seminar, about multiculturalism, about rights, about this sort of juggling of different perceptions of the person and relationship to the nation, and what should the national include. They're quite similar across the board. Yes, there are differences. Yes, there are neo-Nazis in Greece, and and so on. But you can discern, you can recognize the same problematics and the same way of raising the questions. Only that they are, you see what I mean? It's striking. I mean, even if you take the three Scandinavian countries, with so different histories, and they end up almost in the same place.
Unfortunately.
If we have time for one more,
okay.
I think it was you, actually.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the migrant communities in sort of set. So you talk about how they relate to the nation, but do they develop other communities, cross-ethnic communities, that are not really directed towards the Norwegian state?
Yes, there are some NGOs. I mean, there are, and so you have cross-cutting ties. I mean, there are anti-racist organizations, for example. There's something called the Islamic Council, which also unites. I mean, there was a Bosnian, there's been a Norwegian convert who's been head of that. Yes. And there are other cross-cutting ties as well. As I just mentioned, I mean, the Minister of Culture, I mean, she's a second generation, parents from Afghanistan. In sport, in various domains. And there's also an interesting internal hierarchy among immigrants between different ethnic categories. With the Pakistani being the most powerful, because they've been there, since the 60s, and they're the most numerous and so on.
Okay.